Hi, this is David Healy with Libre. Today we're going to take a look at Lyrical Bansuri. So this is an Indian bamboo flute and it runs in the Rhapsody player. Let's quickly go over the UI. So in the top left we have the velocity curve editor. So we can click to add nodes to this. We can right click between two nodes, and while holding the right click down we can move our mouse up and down to adjust the curve between those nodes. And we can right click on the nodes we've added to remove them. In the centre of the UI we have the articulation list. To the right of each one of these articulations we can see the key switch, which will trigger the articulation, and those are coloured in red on the on-screen keyboard. And to the far right of each articulation we have a little volume slider, so we can adjust the relative volume between articulations. So here's the sustained articulation and the sustained tongued articulation. And if we pull down the volume on this one slightly, we can compare it to the sustain. So you can hear it's just slightly quieter now. So it does what you would expect. Over at the right hand side we have the dynamic section. We can control expression, which by default is mapped to CC11. And you can change that mapping by right clicking on the control, selecting Learn MIDI CC and moving a controller. And that applies to most of the knobs on the UI. We also have the dynamics knob. This controls the dynamic crossfade of the performance, sustain and sustained tongue samples. And basically any samples where this control is illuminated. For example, if I click the staccato sample, we can see this control is grayed out. So only when that control is active for a particular articulation will it have any effect. And the dynamics are assigned to the mod wheel by default. So the performance, the sustain and the sustained tongued articulations are all phase aligned, so you'll get really smooth crossfades between the dynamic layers. You shouldn't be able to hear any phasing or artifacts. Let me turn that vibrato down so we can hear the sustain a bit better there. So a really nice smooth crossfade between those layers. Okay, and then down here in the bottom right, as we just saw, we've got the vibrato controls. So we have the depth of the vibrato, so this is the amount of vibrato. And with the rate knob we can control the speed of the vibrato. And we can double click to set these to their default positions. In the lower left we have the envelope control. This is the AHDSR envelope. It doesn't affect the performance articulation because that's using its own internal envelope system. So it's grayed out when the performance is selected, but for the other articulations we have access to it. And we can adjust the attack curve as well. And this envelope is different for each articulation, so each one gets its own set of controls. So we'll go with the tongued articulation, for example. I can increase the attack, and when I go back to the sustain, you can see it's got its own settings there. So the last thing to cover on the UI is the keyboard. So we've already seen the key switches. We've also got this blue key here, C1, and what that does is it repeats the last note that was played. This is useful, especially with the shorter articulations, for doing really fast repeated sections. So double tonguing, triple tonguing, that kind of thing. Right, so now let's just have a play through some of these articulations. So this is the performance articulation, which I've used in some of my other instruments, my woodwind instruments especially, and this is the one that you can use if you want to perform the instrument. So it will do things, if we play an overlap note, that's where we hold one down and play another one, it will play a legato transition. And that will adapt to the speed that we play as well. If we play a chord, it will play a chord. If we hold down the sustain pedal while performing a legato, it will actually trigger a glide. And it will glide using the samples that are played and the ones in between, so we get this form and correct glide and it's really smooth. Now obviously a glide like that isn't really possible on the Bansuri, but this is the virtual world so we can do what we want. The speed of the glide is controlled by how hard we play the second note, so the velocity. A higher velocity results in a faster glide. And a slower one. So this is great for simple pitch bends. Or of course you can use your pitch wheel controller for that. With the performance articulation selected, we can also play short notes, staccatos, maccatos, accents, any kind of little short notes, and you do that just by releasing the key earlier. And the velocity will control the intensity of the attack of those notes. So the last thing about the performance articulation is it makes use of both the sustain and the sustained tongued samples. So if you play a lower velocity, you're going to get sustained, which has a softer attack. And if you play a bit harder, you'll get the sustained tongued samples, which have a harder attack. And it's more noticeable at higher dynamics. Okay, so let's move on to the sustained articulation. So this is just the sustained samples with the 3 dynamics crossfaded. But there's no legato, there's no performance techniques here. Then we've got the sustained tongued, which is the same kind of thing, except these samples have a tongued attack. Then we've got the gamak up, which is a very traditional Indian articulation. So you get that little grace note leading up to the sustain, and the gamak down, which is the same kind of thing but in the opposite direction. So when you're playing something like the gamak, you can hold the note down, press the performance articulation key switch, and then go into a performance. We've got the crans, which are another ornament going into a sustain. Staccatos, which are shorter notes. So the dynamic level of these is controlled by the velocity that you play at. Staccatissimo, which is even shorter. These are like little blips. And the marcato, which is another short articulation but with a bit of an accent. And of course you can play these also with the performance articulation, so if we wanted to do a marcato, we'd just play a higher velocity and a short note. And it's going to sound a bit different because it's not using the same samples, but you can get the same technique going. So this makes the performance articulation great also as a sketching tool, because you can lay down your track with all the articulations using the performance, but then to get the more authentic sound you can go through afterwards and put in the different key switches to trigger the genuine samples. So what we've been hearing so far is Lyrical Bansuri with a bit of reverb and delay to add a bit of space to the library. Because I generally like to record my libraries very dry, it gives me more room to maneuver when I'm trying to fit the samples into the virtual soundstage with other instruments. So I'm going to turn off the reverb and delay now so that we can just hear the naked samples. So keep in mind when you're using this library, you're probably going to want to add some spatialization to it to make it fit in with whatever you're doing. Okay, so this is the dry, naked library. So that was Lyrical Bansuri from Libre. I hope this library sounds interesting to you. I put links below the video, so please go and check it out, have a listen to the demos, and see what you think of it. Thank you very much for watching, and enjoy the rest of your day.